Good morning, everyone. So this is the second part of the lecture. Today I'll be discussing the EBV infection after pediatric transplant. So as we had previously discussed, EBV is also a part of the herpes virus family. It is otherwise known as HHV4, and with a subfamily of gamma viruses. And as opposed to CMV viruses, it primarily affects the B cells and the epithelial cells in oropharynx when it causes the primary infection. The clinical presentation is, we are interested in only two forms of presentation. One is the form which presents acutely, that is the non-PTLD forms. Like the most common form is infectious mononucleosis. And second most common is the organ-specific diseases like hepatitis, pneumonitis, or GI symptoms. Third is the hematological manifestations, predominantly cytopenias like leukopenia, thrombocytopenia, hemolytic anemia, and sometimes secondary HLA syndromes. PTLD is the form which is that is post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder. It is the form which we are most interested in because that has the most prognostic significance once it develops in the patient who is post-transplant. PTLD prevalence varies across different transplant settings. Most commonly in liver, it varies from 1 to 5.5%. The recent study, which looked after more than 2,000 transplants, it had a prevalence of, in adults, it was 2.3%, and children had a higher prevalence that was around 5.1%. Overall prevalence was around 3.8%. Clinical features of PTLD primarily would include, because you have to understand that EBV infection starts in the oropharynx. So you would have chronic lymphadenopathy, especially with swollen lymph nodes. You may have sinus congestion and discomfort. You may have systemic symptoms. That is how we evaluate these patients when they come to an OPD. They would have weight loss. They would have fevers or night sweats. They would have malaise and lethargy and other symptoms when they start affecting the specific organs. The signs you always look for peripheral lymphadenopathy. You look for splenomegaly. You look for tonsillar enlargement or tonsillar inflammation, and other signs are specific to the organ-specific involvement. Predominantly, as we have seen, this was a compilation of all the previous literature. This was a review of PTLD disorder. So you can make out that more than half of the patient would present with fever. They would have lymphadenopathy. They would have weight loss. They would have GI symptoms. They would have infectious mononucleosis-like syndrome. Mononucleosis syndrome would include fever, lymphadenopathy, swollen lymph nodes. These are the kind of presentation that they may present acutely. This was a study that I was talking about, published this year only. More than 2,000 liver transplants between over a 30-year period that included almost 1,000 liver, 1,000 pediatric, and 1,000 adult transplants. Overall prevalence was around 3.8% in this study. And prevalence was onset of this PTLD was earlier in children as compared to adults, 14 months versus 57 months. And half of the pediatric PTLD developed in the first year after transplant. That is, the first year after transplant is the most common period when the PTLD starts developing, especially in the pediatric population. Overall, more than half of these patients died, and overall survival was significantly worse in adults compared to the pediatric population. And then they developed a score that if you are an adult, if you have an age more than 18 years of age, if you have a poor performance status, and you have a monomorphic type, and then they developed this score which divides these patients into low, intermediate, or high risk group based on these three parameters: age, monomorphic pathology, and performance status. They divided these patients into these prognostic groups. There is a differentiation when we start describing these patients in early and late PTLD. Early PTLD, the usually most common definition that they use is the onset in the first year after transplant, and late PTLD is after the first year of transplant. Early PTLD is predominantly diffuse large B cell or other B cell lymphomas, and they are predominantly B cell origin. That means primarily you would find a positivity of EBV infections in these cases. Late PTLD are predominantly Burkitt lymphomas and Hodgkin's lymphoma-like disease. I'll explain the different subtypes of PTLD later. And they are frequently EBV negative, and most commonly the translocations or other chromosomal aberrations are predominantly seen in late onset PTLD. The risk factors for PTLD, early PTLD is predominantly primary EBV infection that we have already seen that predominantly these early PTLDs are EBV positive. Most commonly, as we have seen, that intestines or multi-organ transplants are most common. They have a relative risk of almost more than 200. That means the intestinal and multi-organ transplant have the highest risk of developing PTLDs, and liver is somewhere in the between. Around 30 times relative risk is there with respect to the development of PTLD. Early induction therapies, if you're using lymphocyte depleting antibodies, they have a higher risk. If you have a younger age, and especially an EBV mismatch, if you have a D plus R minus status, that donor is positive and recipient is negative, if there is a mismatch at transplant, it is considered one of the most important feature of or prognostic factor, negative prognostic factor for development of EBV infection and therefore later onset of PTLD. Younger age, definitely younger age, because infants, especially infants and younger children, they are R minus, that means the recipient would be negative, and predominantly since they are getting their organs from the adult side, they have definitely a donor mismatch. Late PTLD is a more common component when you have a higher cumulative immunosuppression, duration of immunosuppression. If you are continuing with high dose immunosuppression, that is one of the most important risk factor for development of late PTLD. There are other controversial factors, including tacrolimus, HLA matching, etc. But these are not very, they have not been confirmed in many studies. So if you look at the pathogenesis, we can understand that acute EBV infection, like infectious mononucleosis-like syndrome, is a self-limiting infection. But since majority of our population in the Indian settings or Asian settings or the Western settings, more than 90% of adults have already been exposed to EBV infection in their childhood or early adulthood. So majority would have evidence of this past infection in their body. But since EBV is a chronic infection, that means once you get infected, you would always have the memory of this infection throughout your life. So what happens is, as we can see that once the EBV starts infecting the B cells, T cells, and NK cells, what it does is it has two basic components. It has an inflammatory component and a neoplastic component. Inflammatory component would mean that it would increase the expression of these CD137 and CD40 on the B cells as well as CD40 ligand on these T cells, NK cells. It would increase the survival of these cells by decreasing the apoptotic pathways by this NF kappa beta and STAT3 pathways. This leads to inflammatory cascade in the form of TNF alpha, interferon gamma, and IL-6 release, and this causes a systemic inflammation. And this systemic inflammation is one of the most important factors which leads to multi-system inflammatory syndromes like HLH syndrome. Also, what it does is it causes this activation-induced cytidine deaminase activity, which causes these genetic aberrations, which most commonly includes the DDX3X mutations. And this leads to clonal evolution in the form of chronic activity, and as well as which subsequently leads to neoplastic transformation of these cells. So two important components for chronic active EBV infection are systemic inflammation and clonal evolution leading to lymphoma or leukemia in such cases. One of the most important factors that we have to understand for understanding the pathophysiology of EBV infection is that EBV infection chronic EBV infection, I must say, goes through multiple transcription programs. That means, I think I can be able to understand this. I show in the next slide also in the diagrammatic form. So you have to understand there are 3 latency programs and 1 LaTeX program. This is the cycle that every EBV infection undergoes. So there are 3 latency programs: growth, default, and latency. Latency 1, latency 2, and latency 3. You have to remember that once they start infecting these their respective cells, that naive B cell, germinal center cell, memory cells, and epithelial plasma cells, these are how the chronic EBV infection continues to evolve. We have to remember we can remember these enzymes which they start expressing: EBNA 126, LMP1, 2, latent membrane protein, Epstein-Barr virus nuclear antigen, Epstein-Barr encoded RNAs, and subsequently some of these they start losing these antigens all throughout their cycles. And LaTeX antigens like BZLF1 and BRLF1 are one of the most important, which I'll tell you the prognostic significance later. So what happens is that EBV life cycle starts in the oropharynx, that is the primary infection, in which EBV starts infecting the epithelial cells and the native B cells, which can be infected either directly by the EBVs or by each other. So this infection of these epithelial cells starts the lytic cycle. Lytic cycle would mean that virus gets into the cells and there is a lysis of these cells. The viruses get released, or either they get controlled by the body's immune system, or they start infecting other cells by the lysis. At the same time, what it does is it starts the latency program. Latency program would mean that now the viruses, though it has caused an acute infection, now it will go to the body, other body cells, and it would continue to remain there throughout their lifetime. And this latent phase consists of 3 successive gene transcription programs. As we already mentioned, growth program, that is the latency 3, then the default program, that is the latency 2, and third is the latency program, which is latency 1 program. So what happens is, this is the most important, this latency program 3, that is the growth program. It is the time when EBV starts developing these B cells or other cells into a blast form. So this is the So this is the cell which is most important. This program or this transcription state is the most important program when this starts developing those PTLDs. So in this, then subsequently, it enters the germinal center, and then it enters the memory B cell. So memory B cells, once it has entered into this memory B cell, that in this, the virus can persist asymptomatically for life. Then once this cycle completes, it can either then go into the plasma cells and then again start the cycle again by increasing the viral replication and subsequent transmission to other B cells, other naive B cells, to continue this cycle. So this is the site when the primary infection takes place, and these are the 3 sites when you have latency programs in which virus continues to remain asymptomatically for life, and whenever the immunosuppression occurs or any other incident occurs, virus reactivates, and this causes the PTLD, especially in the growth or blast program of this cell. So how do you diagnose? So I will be focusing more on PTLD diagnosis rather than diagnosis of EBV infection per se. Serology is not used to diagnose EBV infection, but it is important to prognosticate. That means you can differentiate the donor and recipient status using the IgG predominantly. Tissue-based PTLD diagnoses are based on detection of these EBV-specific nucleic acids, especially in the EBV encoded RNAs. These are the histological diagnosis whenever you are diagnosing a case of EBV infection. If you have PTLD, EBER staining is the most important staining that they use for histological diagnosis. And viral load, that obviously EBV viral load is the EBV DNA testing for PCR is the most important test to diagnose the viral load currently in a EBV infection. Non-specific, they may present with lymphopenia, normostatic normochromic, or hypochromic microcytic anemia, and thrombocytopenia per se. EBV load has the most significance that we give in a case of EBV infection. So once you have primary infection, EBV viral load would go up, then it would continue to remain at a lower level. And once you start giving them iatrogenic immunosuppression, especially in a post-transplant patient, it would continue to increase along with the symptomatology of the patient. And then once the therapy, you have completed the therapy, you have decreased the immunosuppression, or things have gone down, they would again fall to a low level. So, but does EBV load per se influence or dictate the terms for PTLD? This was a study that was published almost 7 years back. There was a kidney transplant patient, pediatric kidney transplant patient. Majority of the studies that we have to understand always come from kidney transplant, and they are subsequently replicated in liver transplant cases. So what happens is, what they showed that there is no actual association between the degree or duration of EBV load and the EBV related mortality. Majority of the patients who had high or persistent EBV load, high load, I think this study used 10 to the power 4 genomes per milliliter as a definition for high load. And persistent means persistent in more than 50% of the samples taken over more than 6 months of duration. So even those patients who had higher EBV load or they had a persistent load lasting more than 6 months, they remained PTLD free. And mostly and majority of the patients who had EBV related PTLD exhibited only a low EBV load. So the risk factors that they found for EBV related PTLD was, as we already mentioned, the high risk status, that means D+R- status, or and intensity of immunosuppression therapy. That is the reason that reduction of immunosuppression therapy is the mainstay of treatment for any PTLD management. So this I have shown that even those patients who had a high EBV load or persistent load, predominantly there was PTLD, percentage of PTLD was low, and there was no difference in the occurrence of PTLD and viral load peak or viral area under curve. EBV infection has been shown that it increases with a higher tag dosage, and this study had shown that MMF actually decrease the risk of EBV infection, but other studies have shown that both TAC and MMF have a negative effect on EBV infection. That means once you start increasing TAC and MMF, EBV infection actually increases. One other thing, this was a study that was published from Pittsburgh. As you can make out that they had high load carriers. High load they had defined as more than 16,000 copies per milliliter, persisting over more than 6 months of duration. So even though they had a significant number of patients who had high load of EBV, asymptomatic high load, I am not talking about symptomatic high load. These were patients who continue to have high loads of viremia, but overall, the patient who progressed to PTLD was just 1 out of 36, that is 2.7%. Compared to, if you compare it to the heart transplant patients, after 20 patients, almost half of these patients developed PTLD. The only difference that they could give is the degree of immunosuppression that they had to use in a cardiac transplant compared to a liver transplant patients, in which liver transplant we usually give a lesser immunosuppression. We even withdraw immunosuppression, but this withdrawal of immunosuppression is actually not possible in heart transplant patients because of very high risk of organ rejection. And since once heart transplant or heart organ starts rejecting, it is very difficult to control that rejection. Therefore, the reduction of immunosuppression is not a very practical feasibility in a heart transplant. Therefore, they have a higher propensity to lead to PTLD in such cases. So chronic heart carrier states, even though they continue to have high-grade viremia, are infrequently associated with progression to recurrent or late onset EBV disease in pediatric liver transplant. Second important aspect is radiology. We always prefer a whole body scan, including brain and neck. It should not just be abdomen and chest, MRI or CT, that is as per the center's preference. PET scan is now being used increasingly more used as an adjunct for diagnosis, staging, as well as assessing the treatment response in conjunction with the whole body scan. This was a study that was published in 2015 in pediatric transplant patients. Addition of FDG PET to CT scan upstaged the disease in almost 1/5 of these patients, and they were complementary at the initial staging of PTLD. And also, PET scan also determined whether they're going to be a risk of relapse. So if you can document that there is no PET avid lesions at the end of your therapy, that can predict a low risk of relapse in the prospective period. There are 4 subtypes of PTLD that are recognized by WHO. One is the non-destructive PTLD, polymorphic PTLD, monomorphic, and Hodgkin's-like PTLD. Non-destructive PTLD is mostly early PTLD, and mostly it is EBV infection. Monomorphic is the most dangerous one or more risky subtype. Predominantly, it is 50% to be EBV positive and 50% to be EBV negative. That includes the most destructive neoplasms like diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, Burkitt's lymphoma, and the other T-cell lymphomas. And it can both be early and late PTLD. I think we can skip. This is the plasmacytic hyperplasia, polymorphic and monomorphic. And this is the EBER staining that I was talking about. EBV included RNA staining used for diagnosing B-cell lymphomas. So how do you manage? Prevention is always better than cure. If you have the high risk factor, you are D plus R minus status, you need to follow up these patients for early diagnosis of EBV viremia and subsequent management. Antiviral prophylaxis for prevention and treatment actually is controversial. They say that ganciclovir inhibits the lytic replication, but it has no effect on the latent transcription program, that latency 1, 2, and 3. So sometimes, but everybody or every center has their own guidelines, and majority would still like to use ganciclovir in at least in the high risk groups. Preemptive therapy would mean that you're going to continue surveillance at the specific intervals and interventions. What you can do once you start finding viremia, you can reduce the immunosuppression, or you may or may not use the antiviral drugs. So this was the meta-analysis that was published in 2017, the role of antiviral prophylaxis for prevention of EBV-related PTLD. Irrespective of the prophylaxis that they give, irrespective of the drugs that they use, irrespective of the age group, adult or pediatric, or irrespective of the drugs that they use, EBV prophylaxis did not actually had a good effect or a positive effect on prevention of PTLD, either prophylactically or preemptively. So why it should be used, but because there is no actual role per se, but what they say is that since these antivirals only affect the lytic cycle, should they be having any effect on the latency period? Because latency 3 site is the stage where PTLD starts developing. But since they only affect the lytic cycle, do they actually have any effect is still controversial. So the treatment, most important is the reduction of immunosuppression. It is a mainstay of treatment. Overall, if you start, some centers would totally stop the immunosuppression. That means they would even stop the steroids. But some say you can drop it down to 5 to 10 milligram. You may reduce the dose of CNIs. You should withdraw the antimetabolites. The response usually starts happening in 2 to 6 weeks. This was a study published almost 10 years back, in which they had 67 patients who were managed with reduction of immunosuppression alone, and almost it caused a response in almost 45% of these cases. But the important factor is that majority they've still developed acute reaction, which has to be managed. Antivirals after you have developed PTLD is a controversial role. If you look at this study that was published 4 years back, if you look at this Zebra Plus is BZLF1 that we have found. This was the antigen that was there in the lytic cycle. The lytic cycle, though it is believed that it does not have a major effect on the PTLD, but in this study, you can see almost majority of these patients had this lytic cycle antigen positivity in confirmed PTLD cases. So that means antivirals may have some role as a concomitant therapy in these cases. So majority of the centers will still, if you have high viremia and you have developed PTLD, some centers would not use antivirals, but majority of centers would still prefer giving antivirals, though it may not have any definite role in management of PTLD. Rituximab is the second-line therapy. If you can see, this was a study that was published almost more than 10 years back, in which only single-agent response, along with reduction of immunosuppression, they found almost 47% had single-agent response in such cases. This has been studied. This is a compilation of studies in which you can make out the overall response rate varies from almost 70 to 80%, well, 40 to 80% as a concomitant therapy along with reduction of immunosuppression. This was the 2 trials that have taken place, reduction of rituximab using as a weekly therapy. Then if there is a progression that you can shift to CHOP therapy, that is cyclophosphamide, doxorubicin, vincristine, and prednisolone therapy. Overall response rate in this study was almost 40% at a median overall survival of 6.6 years. Then they subsequently increased or modified this protocol that they first gave weekly therapy of rituximab. If there was complete remission, they continued to give 4 more doses of rituximab at 3 weekly interval. If there was no complete remission, they shifted to the chemotherapy, that is CHOP therapy along with G-CSF, and the response rate actually increased up to 70%. This is the protocol that is followed. This was a protocol that is followed in pediatric PTLDs. What you give, these are 6 cycles, 3 weekly interval. using low dose cyclophosphamide. This is a reduced immunosuppression, reduced chemotherapy protocol. They don't use the more complete CHOP therapy, but they use low dose cyclophosphamide and prednisolone along with rituximab as a therapy. And overall, you can say with rituximab, 2-year overall survival rate was almost more than 80%. This is pretty good survival rate compared to adult population. So last slide. So the protocol that I think I can propose is EBV infection. The most important thing that, especially in the high-risk group, you should start monitoring. Monitoring is difficult compared to the CMV infection, CMV viremia, but at least what you can do is you can do 1 to 2 weekly monitoring for the first 3 months, and then you can subsequently decrease it. Since the most important time period for developing PTLD is the first year after transplant, so that is the most important period that you should monitor preemptively in these cases. Watch for viremia. If you have to look for PTLD, how do you look for PTLD? You should look for systemic signs and symptoms like fever, lymphadenopathy, tonsillar hypertrophy, GI symptoms, weight loss, fatigue, malaise, abdominal pain, especially refractory iron deficiency anemia. Once you start suspecting clinically or laboratory-wise that patient may have PTLD, you should look for EBV viremia. Some studies have shown that risk increases when the virus levels increases more than 10 to power 4 or 16,000 copies per ml. You should look for high ESR, high LDH, high uric acid, positive stool or cut blood. You should do a complete whole body scan, CT or MRI as per your preference. And majority of the centers have now started using PET CT at the baseline along with a whole body CT scan. Biopsy should always be done. Liver transplant means predominantly it is a liver which gets involved. So liver biopsy or bowel biopsy should always be done. And tissue biopsy using EBR staining plus CD20 staining for rituximab response prediction should always be done. So once you have EBV viremia and you do not find any evidence of PTLD, but you have persistent prolonged EBV viremia, you call them a phenotype, which can last for months to years. They may continue to have high levels of viremia without developing PTLD. In these cases, what you can do is some people say that you can continue to keep them under surveillance. You may do a yearly whole body scan just to pick up an early disease. But once you have confirmed the dose of PTLD, the step 1 is reduction of immunosuppression. Some centers stop all immunosuppression, even on low dose steroids. They would stop antimetabolites. They would reduce the dose of TAC to more than by 30 to 50%, may decrease prednisolone to 5 to 10 milligram or stop it altogether. And some may shift to sirolimus. There is a controversial role. Once a PTLD has developed, majority of the centers would not prefer using antivirals. They use only antivirals once it is in the viremia group, not in the PTLD confirmed group. Step 2 is if there is no response within 2 to 6 weeks, you must repeat a biopsy and you start using rituximab at 375 milligram per meter square weekly for at least 4 doses. If there is still no response, you should repeat the biopsy and you should shift the patient to a chemotherapy protocol like CHOP for adults or low dose cyclophosphamide and prednisolone therapy for pediatric population. Thank you.